They gave her a new name the morning. They decided she wasn't a person anymore. The name was not spoken aloud. It was entered into a database somewhere in the bowels of the Conclave's administrative ship. A vessel so large it blotted out the star when it orbited, and printed on a tag that clipped to the collar of the gray smock they issued to every breeding asset. The tag read, Asset 7 Veth 9. 7 for the breeding cycle she'd been assigned to. Veth for the overseer family she would serve. Not because she was the 9th human woman the Veth household had processed. Her name was Mara Calloway. She kept that to herself, the way you keep a flame cupped against the wind. The morning they clipped the tag to her collar, she was standing in a processing bay aboard the station. What the humans called the cradle, though no child born here had ever been cradled. The bay smelled of antiseptic, and something underneath it that she could never identify. Something biological and faintly sweet, the way the Kethva smelled when they were calm. The Kethva were rarely calm. They were a species that read equilibrium as an insult, that performed agitation the way some species performed greeting. Their long facial structures, not quite mouths, quite beaks, were always working, always clicking. She had learned in the first week that the clicking meant they were thinking. It was one of the few things the orientation hadn't lied to her about. Overseer Veth Marath was there to receive her. Flanked by her bonded mate, stood slightly behind and to the left in the posture that indicated legal subordination, and by 2 compliance officers in the flat gray armor of the Conclave's enforcement arm. Mara had been told not to make eye contact with the overseers. She was told this by an orientation aunt. The humans had started calling them that. The women the Kethva used to condition incoming breeding assets. The women who had agreed to something Mara refused to name. And the aunt had seemed to believe that the rule protected Mara somehow. It did not protect Mara. It protected the Kethva from having to acknowledge that the thing in the smock had eyes. She looked at the floor. She noted the composition. Pressed fibrous material, dark green, made from a plant she did not know. She noted that it was slightly warm underfoot through her issued slippers. She noted that in the far corner, behind the compliance officers, another woman stood in a smock identical to hers. The woman caught Mara's eye for a fraction of a second before both of them looked down again. Mara thought, she's doing the same math I am. She's counting us. The overseer spoke to her translator, not to Mara. The translator was a device clipped to the overseer's lower facial ridge, and it converted the Kethva's acoustic language, a shimmer of clicks and subsonic tones, into approximate standard. Approximate. That was the word Mara kept coming back to. Everything here was approximate. The translation was approximate. The kindness was approximate. The humanity was approximate, then less than that, then nothing at all. Asset acknowledges its assignment, the translator said. It was not a question. Mara said yes. She did not say yes because she agreed. She said yes because she had learned. In the 18 days since the transport ship had docked with the Conclave fleet and the processing had begun, exactly what No produced and what it cost. She said yes the way you say yes to someone holding your daughter by the wrist at the edge of a cliff. You say yes, and you keep breathing and you look for the handhold that will get you both back from the edge. Mara's daughter was 6 years old. Her name was Petra. She was being held in the dependent ward 2 levels below, in a room that Mara was allowed to see only in photographs. The photographs were delivered once a week, printed on the thin paper the Kethva used for administrative documents. In each one, Petra was wearing a small gray smock of her own, sitting at a small gray table, drawing something with a gray stylus on gray paper. Every photograph was the same photograph Mara had come to understand. Same angle, same expression, not frightened, which was the cruelest part. She looked distracted. The way children look when they're somewhere they do not understand and have stopped trying to. The Kethva probably thought the photographs were a comfort. They probably did not understand why a mother would find them devastating. That was the thing. They did not understand. They were very old. The Kethva had been a spacefaring species for longer than humanity had been bipedal, and in all that time, across all the worlds they had catalogued and claimed and processed, they had found nothing that surprised them. They had excellent science. They had excellent administrative systems. They had a theology of profound tidiness that explained the universe from its particle to its last and left no room in it for anything unexpected. When the survey ships had found Earth, when they had found, against all probability, an oxygen-breathing, carbon-based species that had developed agriculture and metallurgy and written language and a baroque, screaming, utterly chaotic civilization, their initial reports had read. Mara was told by an orientation aunt who had read them, like the notes of a zookeeper who had opened a cage and found it full of fire. Interesting, dangerous, containable. They had been wrong about the third thing. They did not know that yet. The Veth household was a 6-room complex in the residential ring of the station. Mara was given a room at the end of a corridor, small, white, containing a sleep surface, a sanitation unit, a ventilation grill through which she could hear distantly what she thought was the sound of other humans sleeping. The room had no window. The station's outer hull was a kilometer of composite alloy. There was no window anywhere in the residential ring. She had not seen a star in 42 days. On her first night, she sat on the sleep surface and pressed her back against the wall and breathed for a very long time. The grief had weight. She had learned that already in the transport ship, in the processing bay, in all the spaces between. Grief was not a feeling, it was a physics. It pressed. It had mass. You did not overcome it. You built around it. The way you built a structure in water, incorporating the pressure instead of fighting it, using the force that wanted to crush you as part of the load-bearing design. She had been a marine engineer. She knew about pressure. She knew that the structures that failed were never the ones that tried to resist the sea. They were the ones that didn't understand it. She breathed. She let the grief be there. She added it to the design. Then she started looking at the room. The first orientation aunt she met was named, or had been named, Sylvia O'Heen. She wore her gray smock with the deliberate tidiness of someone who had decided that dignity was a practice you perform even in humiliation. She had been in conclave custody for 3 years. She had the eyes of a person who had grieved everything she could afford to grieve, and now operated on the fuel of whatever came after grief. She showed Mara the room. She showed her the sanitation unit. She showed her where the meal allocations were delivered and when. She showed her the approved corridor, the approved timing for supervised interaction, approved topics, which did not include names of family members left behind, names of places, names of anything the Kethfa considered sentimental contamination. The Kethfa had a word for the human tendency to organize experience around emotional attachment, around the specific gravity of love and loss and specific people. The word translated approximately as inefficiency. Sylvia did all of this in a flat, calm voice, and then she sat down on the edge of the sleep surface and said, "What did you do before?" Mara said, "I was an engineer. Marine construction. Bridge building, underwater infrastructure." Sylvia looked at her for a moment with an expression Mara couldn't read. Then she said, "Good, that's good." "Why?" Sylvia said, "Because that means you know how to look at a structure and understand which part of it, if removed, brings the whole thing down." She did not say anything else. She got up and left. Mara stood in the small white room and listened to the distant sound of humans breathing through the ventilation grill and thought about bridges. Thought about the point of failure. Thought about load-bearing walls and keystones and the principle. She'd learned it in her first year of engineering school, had it drilled into her until it was reflex, that every structure has a weakness, and every weakness can be found if you are patient enough and systematic enough, and if you are not under any circumstances afraid. She was afraid. She was afraid every second. She kept that to herself too, like the name, like the flame. The Veth household's function, as Mara gradually understood it, was reproductive administration. Overseer Veth Marath and her bonded mate were of a Keth-Ve bloodline that had, over several generations, developed what their species regarded as a tragic infertility. The Keth-Ve reproduced through a process that bore only metaphorical resemblance to what Mara understood by the word. It involved a chemical exchange and a gestational period measured in years, and they had discovered, 2 decades ago, that human gene sequences could, under certain laboratory conditions, be induced to accelerate Keth-Ve gestation by a factor of 7. They did not understand why. Their science, for all its age and sophistication, had limits. And the limits had something to do with the fact that they had never developed curiosity as a value in itself. They were very good at describing. They were less good at wondering. So they used humans. Specifically, they used women of childbearing age in a protocol so sanitized and bureaucratized and wrapped in administrative language that Mara suspected the Kethva who had designed it had genuinely believed they were being humane. The protocol was called gestation facilitation. The orientation aunts called it the ceremony. The other assets called it other things, in the moments when compliance officers were not close enough to hear. Mara called it what it was, privately, in the room with no window, her anger working through her like a cold current in deep water. She was introduced to the other assets, in the Veth household, gradually, in the approved manner. Supervised interaction in the common corridor, outside meal distribution, for 20 minutes per day. There were 4 of them. Sylvia, who had been there longest, a woman from what had been the Philippines named Lainey Cruz, who had been a fisheries biologist, and who had the stillness of someone who had decided that stillness was the only weapon left to her. She was wrong about that, as it turned out, but the stillness was useful in the meantime. A girl who could not have been more than 22, who gave her name as Day and nothing else, and who kept her arms wrapped around herself in a posture that Mara recognized as armor. The posture of someone who had learned that their body was the only territory they still trolled and was defending it with everything they had. And a woman named Oksana Vishkova, who had been a trauma surgeon, who had a prosthetic left hand made from salvaged cargo drone parts that the compliance officers had somehow missed or decided not to care about, and who smiled at Mara on that first day in the corridor with a warmth so unexpected it almost broke Mara open entirely. "You have the look," Sana said. "What look?" "The look of someone who has not yet decided whether to survive or fight." She tilted her head. The prosthetic hand flexed once, its fingers curling in a motion that struck Mara as deliberate. "I recommend deciding quickly. There is more overlap between the two things here than you might expect." They had 20 minutes. Mara used 4 of them confirming what she'd already decided. 6 of them asking careful questions about the station's layout that Oksana answered in the tone of someone talking about meal allocation timing, and the remaining 10 standing close enough to Oksana's shoulder to feel the slight, mechanical warmth radiating from the prosthetic hand and understanding, with the part of her brain that was always running structural assessments. Someone had put something in that hand that was not supposed to be there. The first ceremony was 2 weeks after Mara's arrival. She was not told in advance. An orientation aunt appeared at her door in the hour before the station's lights dimmed to their sleep cycle, handed her a clean smock and told her to come. They walked to a room Mara had not been in before, in a part of the household complex she had not been shown. The room was larger than her own. It had a ceremonial quality, a quality the Kethva achieved, through the use of a particular light frequency that their species found significant in ways Mara had no reference for. And Overseer Vethmarath was there, and her bonded mate, and a medical administrator, and it happened, and Mara lay still, and looked at the ceiling, and thought about load distribution, thought about the tensile strength of carbon fiber versus steel cable, thought about her daughter's face, which she had memorized, she kept behind her sternum like a second heartbeat. Thought about the cold current of anger, and let it move through her, and did not let it. Her face, the ceiling had 43 tiles. She counted them. She named them silently after bridges. Akashi, Verrazano, Golden Gate. One she had been part of building in the Mariana corridor that had no name yet, only a project code. She named them, and she breathed and she waited for it to be over. And when it was over, she walked back to the room with no window with the aunt beside, not speaking, and she did not say anything. And she sat on the edge of the sleep surface, and she pressed both hands flat against her thighs. The second time, she counted the tiles faster. She was on to something more complex. She was running load calculations in her head, the old discipline of it, the way it filled exactly the right portion of her mind, the technical portion, and left the rest of her available to file what she was seeing, what she was learning, what she was adding to the structural assessment of everything she touched. The third time, she realized she no longer needed to count the tiles. She knew the ceiling by heart. She knew this room. She knew the administrative pattern of the household, the rotation of the compliance officers, the specific timing of the meal distribution, the 18-second window between the corridor's sensor cycling and the officers completing their equipment check, the gap that the network engineer 3 blocks over would later confirm from her own observations. She knew the ventilation system's frequency. She knew the sanitation unit's power draw. She knew the subsonic layer of the Kethva's acoustic language that the xenobiologist would later teach her to read. That overseer Veth Marath was frightened of something, had been frightened for months, was hiding it beneath the filing language of administrative procedure. She knew where the load-bearing wall was. She started counting something else. Not days. Days were what you counted when you were waiting. She was not going to wait. She counted people. 4 assets in the Veth household. An unknown number in adjacent households. She could hear them through the ventilation grills, sometimes catch a word or two, could map the rhythm of their breathing against the rhythm of the station's systems, and understand something about the spaces they occupied. Sylvia had indicated, without saying so directly, that there were hundreds of assets on this station. The Keth-Ve population of the station was smallish than it appeared. Most of the volume was given over to infrastructure, to administrative systems, to the machinery of a civilization that ran on paperwork and process, and the assumption that the things being processed were not thinking about the people who designed the machines. She counted orientation aunts. She counted the rotation of the compliance officers. She noted when the officers were bored, which was almost always. The Keth-Va regarded the assets as settled, as processed, as filed and therefore resolved. In the way you regard a problem, you believe you have already solved. She noted that the officer's armor had a seam along the left shoulder that she recognized as a manufacturing shortcut. She had seen the same shortcut in underwater pressure suits, and she knew what it meant, which was that the person who designed the suit had not expected it to be used under real pressure. The Keth-Va built for the world they had experienced. They had not experienced this. She counted what she knew about the station's systems. She had been a marine engineer. She had spent 15 years building structures in conditions designed by nature to destroy them. She knew about pressure and resistance and the uses of constraint. She knew that the most efficient way to apply force was not the most obvious way. She knew that the Keth-Va, for all their centuries of experience, had never built anything in genuine opposition. They had built in the expectation of compliance. Every system they had created assumed the thing being contained wanted to be contained, or at minimum had no framework for imagining that it didn't. They had found a species that did not comply. They had not updated their assumptions. That was the load-bearing wall. The network began with Oksana's hand. The prosthetic had been built from salvaged parts, and in the base of its palm, shielded by the crude housing of a cargo drone actuator, was a piece of technology so small and unremarkable that the compliance officers had filed it under irrelevant. It was a signal repeater, removed from a maintenance drone by an asset in a previous household who had traded it up the chain through a sequence of 20-minute corridor interactions, spanning 4 months, waiting for someone with the technical knowledge to use it. The first woman in the chain had been a radio operator. She had passed it to a communications technician, who had passed it to a navigation analyst, who had passed it to a woman who had been, before any of this, a hospital electrical engineer. The hospital electrical engineer had passed it to Oksana because Oksana had the hand that could carry it without setting off the sensors. Oksana had been waiting for someone who knew what to do with it next. She explained this to Mara in the corridor on the 41st day, standing close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, speaking in a voice no louder than breath, shh, while Sylvia conducted a conversation with Leni 3 meters away that was designed to give the overhead sensor something to focus on. The sensor had a 90-degree field. It did not rotate. The Keth-Va had not built it to rotate, because in their experience nothing in a surveilled space moved in unexpected directions. It's a local repeater, Oksana murmured. Range of about 60 meters if you push it. Enough to reach 2 adjacent household blocks. Mara said, what's it repeating? Right now? Nothing. It needs to be keyed to a carrier signal. Oksana's prosthetic hand moved. Her real fingers, her right hand, touched Mara's arm once briefly. Sylvia says you build things. Mara thought about what she would need, thought about what she had. The sanitation unit in her room had a current regulator. She had noticed it on. The third day, had been noticing everything, had been filing everything in the engineering part of her brain that ran underneath the grief and the fear and the anger like bedrock. The meal distribution system ran on a frequency she had identified by touch. She had put her hand on the delivery panel every day for 6 weeks and felt soft vibration through her palm, had cross-referenced it against everything she remembered about standard conclave administrative infrastructure from the briefing documents she'd been given during transport, which she had also memorized. She had memorized because she memorized everything she had ever read, a habit from her first years in engineering school, when she had been a woman in a field that kept losing her materials and assuming she couldn't read the blueprints, and she had decided at 21 that she would carry everything in her head where no one could take it from her. Nothing about her situation since had suggested she'd been wrong. She told Oksana what she needed: a current regulator, 3 centimeters of the conductive thread from the lining of the meal distribution panel, could be removed with a thumbnail and was not monitored. Because the HFY had not modeled for someone dismantling infrastructure one thread, a fragment of the floor material to use as insulation. And the repeater itself, Oksana said, 3 weeks. It took 11 days. What Mara built was not large. It fit in the space beneath the ventilation grill, secured with a length of fibrous material stripped from the underside of the sleep surface. It was not elegant. It was the kind of engineering you did when you had no tolerance for failure, and no tools, and no time, and a very clear understanding of which outcome not afford. She had built things like it before, in the sea, in the dark, with nitrogen narcosis, beginning to blur the edges of her thinking, and she had learned then what she understood more completely now. Fear is not the opposite of capability. Fear is sometimes fuel. She tested it on the 47th day, sent a pulse so short it would register, if the sensors caught it at all, as a system artifact. Waited. Received, 3 minutes later, a return pulse from a direction that corresponded, in her mental map of the station, to the household block 2 corridors over. Someone over there had something to receive with. They'd been waiting too. The signal went out on the 49th day. It went to 3 household blocks first. Then, over the following week, through a relay chain that Mara had mapped with Oksana and that Sylvia had cross-referenced against what she knew of the station's layout. Sylvia, 3 years, and she had spent all of them watching and filing the geography of this place into the part of her mind the HFY could access to 11 more. Then to 23, once the network engineer 3 blocks over finished the amplification modification Mara had described in a signal burst, coded into what Sylvia called her smuggler's grammar, the abbreviated shorthand 2 women developed when they had been having a 20-minute approved conversation for 3 months and had long since said everything the sensors were supposed to hear. She did not know all the names of the women at the other ends. She knew some of them by profession, because profession was what they traded in the early signals. The careful identification of capability, talent census of what this population could do. There was the network engineer. There was a xenobiologist 1 block down who had spent 2 years learning to read HFY acoustic language. Not the translated approximation, but the actual subsonic layer, the emotional undertone the translation devices stripped out. And what she had learned was that the overseers were frightened, had been frightened for months. Something was happening on the outer edges of the conclave's territory, something the administrative language carefully didn't name. And the HFY were afraid of it, and therefore filing it in a category they called unresolved external variables, which was where they put things they did not have a protocol for. The xenobiologist thought the variable might be human. Mara did not let herself hope. It was a thing you could spend carelessly and then have nothing left when you needed it. She let herself plan, which was different from hoping. Planning was the engineering of possibility. You identified your load-bearing walls. You identified your point of maximum leverage. You calculated the sequence of removals that would bring the structure down in the direction you wanted it to fall. Not randomly, not catastrophically, but precisely in the controlled demolition pattern that decades of building things had taught her was the only way to remove something large without destroying everything around it. She drew the plan in her head, every line of it. She would not write it down. Paper was accounted for, and the HFY, whatever else they were, maintained excellent administrative records. She drew it and she revised it, and she drew it again. She sent sections of it, in the smuggler's grammar, through the network. She received modifications back. The fisheries biologist, Leni, identified something Mara had missed: the water processing system. Leni watched it for months with the patience of someone who had once tracked fish migration patterns across 3,000 kilometers of open ocean, watching for the moments when the system cycled, feeling for the frequency the way Mara felt for vibration in a delivery panel. She knew where, if you applied pressure at precisely the right point, the recycling pumps would stutter, and the station's internal temperature would drop 6 degrees, enough to trigger a system-wide heating response. And the heating response drew power from the security grid. 2 minutes of reduced sensor coverage. 3 if the system hesitated, which Leni had observed it doing, once, when she'd pressed the panel at a slightly different angle. 2 minutes was enough. Mara revised the plan. Then day came to her on the 58th day. She appeared at the door in the hour before sleep cycle, and she was shaking, and she had the expression of someone who has been holding something at arm's length for a very long time, and can no longer hold it. Arms were around herself in the armor posture. Her chin was up. She was 22 years old, and she was the bravest person Mara had ever seen, and Mara did not say that because it would not have helped. Mara let her in. She sat her on the edge of the sleep surface. She did not say anything for a while, because she had learned, in the years before all of this, building in the sea with crews who had their own weights to carry, that sometimes the kindest thing was silence, that sometimes a person needed to be in a room with another person and not yet required to speak. After a long time, Day said, "I was supposed to have my first ceremony tonight." She stopped. "I didn't," Mara said quietly. "What happened?" "I told them I wouldn't." Arms tightened. "I told the aunt I wouldn't go. She said there would be consequences," I said. She stopped again. Mara waited. Told her my name. She didn't know what that meant. I told her anyway. The compliance officers would have filed a report. There would be a consequence in the morning. Whatever the consequence was, would also be a demonstration for every other asset on this level. That was how these systems worked. Mara knew that. She had seen it in the processing records the network engineer had pulled from an administrative terminal in a 17-second window during a sensor gap. The HFY used consequences pedagogically. They believed consequence was how you established compliance. They were wrong about that too. Mara sat with what she knew, and with the girl next to her who had done the bravest, most tactically important thing Mara had planned for and not planned for. She had not wanted it to happen this way. Not for someone this young, not before she was ready. And she'd the decision she'd been building toward for 58 days. Not because the plan was complete. It wasn't. There were still variables unresolved, contingencies she hadn't fully mapped, a segment of the relay chain that depended on a signal going through a maintenance corridor at a time she hadn't confirmed, was never going to be entirely ready. You built the bridge across the water that was actually there, not the water you'd planned for. You built it with what you had, and you trusted the foundation, and you crossed. She reached under the ventilation grill. She keyed the signal. She did not send a coded message. She sent her own name first, Mara Calloway, because this was how you began. This was the first act of structural removal. You took the name back. You said, "Here is what they tried to delete, and I am still here. I am still this. I am still exactly this." And then she said, clearly and slowly, in the standard that carried across the network to every woman at every end of the chain they had built together over 58 days, that it was time. She told them what to do. She told them in what order. She told them where to be, and what to carry, and what not to carry. And she said at the end, in the tone she had used in every underwater construction briefing she had ever run, the one that said, "I have done the calculation, and I am certain of the foundation, even when I cannot be certain of the water. We are going to be fine." She did not know if that was true. She said it anyway. She had learned that from her crews. What happened over the next 6 hours was not orderly. It was not the carefully staged operation Mara had sketched in her mind during the long hours in the room, with no window, running clean lines and clean sequences and contingencies, mapped in neat columns. It was louder and more chaotic and more human than anything she had planned. And it worked because of that. Because the Kethva had built their systems for an orderly species. A species that approached force in a logical sequence. That escalated in predictable increments. That could be modeled and projected. What came through their corridors and their administrative sectors and their compliance posts was not logical. It was specific. It was the stubbornness of women who had been told they were assets and had filed that word somewhere it could not touch them. It was the particular human capability for improvisation under pressure, for adapting to the immediate material of the situation, fixing the wing of the plane with duct tape, and getting it home. It was the xenobiologist who had spent 2 years learning the Kethva's emotional undertones and now broadcast on every frequency the station used, the acoustic signature of absolute terror, not human terror, which the Kethva categorized as an asset malfunction. But Kethva terror, the frequency that the species was hardwired to respond to, that triggered an emergency protocol response, hard-coded into their administrative systems, that sent every available compliance officer flooding toward the administrative ring in exactly the wrong direction. It was Oksana Vishkova walking through a compliance post with her prosthetic hand held wide open, palm out, because the xenobiologist had learned that this gesture, in Kethva body language, was the formal equivalent of "I have important information for your superior." And the officers had paused for the critical second it took to process the cultural signal. The half-second of neural processing that existed in every species that had ever developed language. The moment between input and response where a human being, or a Kethva, or anything that thinks, goes through the question, am I reading this correctly? And in that half-second, Oksana walked past them and kept walking. It was Lenny Cruz, the water processing system, pressing the panel at the angle she had practiced for weeks, feeling the frequency shift under her palm, watching the temperature indicator begin its descent, calm as a woman reading migration data, calm as the sea on a clear day in a place she had loved and would find her way back to. It was Sylvia O'Heen, who had been here 3 years and knew every orientation aunt on this level, standing at the door of the dependent ward with the stillness and tidiness she had maintained for 1,000 days as a practice of dignity, and saying to the aunt on duty, in the flat, calm, certain voice of someone who has decided, I am collecting the children now, not asking. The aunt had opened her mouth. Sylvia had looked at her with eyes that had run out of grief and arrived somewhere on the other side of it, somewhere clear and decided and done, and the aunt had stepped aside. Mara was at the station's external communications array when the lockdown. She had 40 seconds. She had counted on 20. She used 35 of them to do the thing she had been building towards since the 41st day, the thing that required everything she knew about signals and load distribution and which wall you pull to bring the structure down in the direction you want. She did not break the array. Breaking it would have been the obvious thing. The thing a system designed to resist damage was designed to absorb. She amplified it. She turned it outward, toward whatever was happening at the edges of conclave space, toward the unresolved external variables the overseers were afraid of, toward whatever had been frightening, a species that had not been frightened of anything in recorded history. And she broadcast on every frequency, the array could reach the closest thing she had, a distress signal, which was not a distress signal, which was something more specific than that. She broadcast names. She broadcast her own name first, then Petra's, then Oksana's name and Sylvia's name and Lenny's name and Day's name and every name she had gathered from the asset database. In the 17 seconds the network engineer had bought her from an administrative terminal 3 weeks ago, hundreds of names, thousands. Every name the Kethva had deleted in favor of a processing code and a household assignment and a gray tag on a gray smock. She broadcast them in standard and in every other language she could approximate in the time she had, because names were not administrative data, names were not file entries. Names were the thing you said when you wanted someone to know that the thing they were talking about was a person, had always been a person, keep being a person in spite of every system designed to suggest otherwise. And underneath all of it, in the standard that every monitoring system in this sector would log, she said, "We are here. We are the ones you are looking for, and we are getting out." The lockdown sealed the corridor 38 seconds after she started. She put her back against the wall. Hands were not steady. She let them shake. She had learned that, in engineering school in 15 years of underwater construction, for solo deep water posting, when the pressure suit had given her a false reading, and she had been 90 meters down before she realized, had held herself still and run the calculation and found her way back up. She had learned that the hands shook after. That was fine. That was the body confirming you were still in it. The body was reporting, "We survived this." Hands shook because they had been holding very still for a very long time. Sylvia found her 4 minutes later, coming down the corridor with Daye and Leni and Oksana and 32 other women and 41 children from the dependent ward, which was more children than Mara had known were there. Which was a number she was going to need to account for. In the next phase of the calculation, she was already running. They were moving quickly and quietly, the way you move when you have agreed on a direction, and you have decided, collectively, that the direction is the only direction. That there is no going back to the small white rooms, and the gray smocks and the photographs, children at gray tables that were not really children at gray tables, but a simulation of communication produced by a species that genuinely believed it was being kind. At the center of the moving group, holding the hand of a woman Mara did not recognize, was a 6-year-old girl in a gray smock, carrying a piece of gray paper with something drawn on it in gray, and she looked up as Mara came toward her, and her expression did the thing that children's expressions do, specific thing that is not describable in engineering terms or structural terms, or any terms Mara had professional access to. It broke open. It became immediately and entirely the face of a child who has found the person she needed. Petra walked directly to Mara and pressed her face against Mara's sternum without saying anything, which was the only thing she needed to say. Mara put her arms around her daughter. She stood very still in the moving corridor, in the red alarm light, pulsing from the station's emergency systems, in the sound of the lockdown cascading through sectors above and below, and around them she breathed. She held the weight of her daughter against her chest, and she let it be the most important weight she had ever calculated, the one everything else was load-bearing for. Then she started moving again. Oksana was watching the airlock indicators on the panel, the external communications room. The indicators were Kethva script, but the xenobiologist had been thorough. She had taught half of them to read Kethva administrative script in the signal sessions over the last 2 weeks, the same way she'd taught them the acoustic layer, carefully and precisely because she believed. And she had been right. She had been consistently right, which was the thing about a xenobiologist. About a person who had spent her career trying to genuinely understand something that was not like her. That understanding the other side's language was never a small thing. It was the difference between knowing where the exit was and not knowing. Oksana said quietly, "Something's docking." Mara lifted her head from where it had been resting, briefly against the top of Petra's. "Big," Oksana said, "very big." Aesthetic fingers flexed, reading the panel's vibration through sensors that were more precise than skin. Not Kethva's signature. A pause that lasted exactly as long as the translation required. Then, in a voice that had come a very long way, through a very narrow space and arrived somewhere that sounded, for the first time in a long time, like something that was not the absence of hope, but the thing that was not absence at all, she said, "It's reading human construction." The room was not silent. The alarms were cycling. The lockdown was still cascading through the station's sectors. And somewhere above them, the Kethva administrative apparatus was attempting to categorize what had happened into a filing framework that had not been designed for this and was failing at the seams, which was, Mara thought, with a part of her mind she had not used in a long time, the part that had once, years ago, sat at a bar after a successful deep water installation and laughed until she cried, exactly what they deserved. She looked at her daughter's face. She thought, of course it is, she thought. We built it for exactly this. Not this mission, this plan. She had not known, 58 days ago, that there was a human ship at the edges of conclave space. Had not known that the unresolved external variable was a rescue fleet, or a resistance fleet, or whatever it was that was on the other side of that airlock. But she had built the signal anyway. She had built the network anyway. She had counted the people, and mapped the system, and found the load-bearing wall, and sent the names into the dark anyway, because that was what you did when you were an engineer. And you had a problem. You did not wait to know whether the bridge would be needed. You built the bridge. She thought about all the things her species had built in exactly this way, in desperation and opposition and the specific stubbornness that arose from being told something was impossible, and finding that the impossibility was not a wall but a door. And the door was locked, and you had spent 49 days on the other side, teaching yourself lockpicking through a ventilation grill. She thought about all the bridges, all the structures raised in bad conditions, with insufficient materials against forces designed to bring them down, and holding, because human beings had been building things that should not hold, in places they should not be since before anyone had to call them anything at all. Every structure has a weakness. Every weakness can be found. They had found it. The airlock, unsealed with a sound that the station's emergency systems immediately categorized as unresolved external variable, which was, Mara thought, probably the most accurate thing they had ever said. The light from the other side of the door was not the flat white of the station's interior, it was gold. It was the color of a star seen through a viewport reflected off new hull plating, the color of something that had been built in a hurry with whatever was available and had gotten here anyway. It was the color of the thing the HFY had found when they opened the cage and noted, in their careful initial survey reports, that it was fire. They had not been wrong about that part. She walked toward it. Her daughter walked with her, her hand in Mara's, other hand still holding the gray paper with the gray drawing. Mara did not look down at it. She did not need to. She knew what children drew when they were somewhere they did not understand. The things they missed, the things they were sure of, the things they were going home to. She walked through the door. Behind her, the station's administrative systems were filing the event under catastrophic unresolved external variable, category, unprecedented, subcategory, tainted failure, recommended action. See previous protocol. And finding that there was no previous protocol, because this had never happened before. Because this was a species that had been in space for 100,000 years, and found, at the end of all of it, that the one thing they had not put in their models was the thing their models could not contain. The word the HFY would eventually use for humans, in the reports and the subsequent administrative reviews, and the long, fractious internal debate about what had gone wrong, and how to categorize it, was one that their language had not previously needed. The word translated approximately as the ones who do not stay filed, Mara Calloway, walking through a door into gold light with her daughter's hand, in hers and 56 other women and 41 children behind her, would have found that funny, in the bar on the other side of this, with a drink in her hand and a view of stars. Her name was Mara Calloway. She had not forgotten. She never would.